we just wrote our first reducer, our user reducer, and we got introduced to some new concepts and some new JavaScript features, such as the switch statement and this default parameter value inside of our function. But now that we have our reducer and we imported it into our root reducer and used our combined reducers function from Redux to create our actual root reducer object, we need to still create our store. Now, in order to create the store, we have to make another file inside of Redux called store.js. And this one is just going to go into its own file, and I'm going to call it store.js. Inside of store.js, we need to import in the create store function, as well as the apply middleware function from Redux. So if you remember from that image that I showed you, what we need to do is add middleware to our store so that whenever actions get fired or dispatched, we can catch them and then display them. And the middlewares, which is the piece in the middle between our actions firing and our root reducer, are pretty much just functions that receive actions in and then do something with them and then pass them out into the root reducer. That's all it is. This Redux logger library that I made you guys install is pretty much just that. And all it does is it catches the action, it console logs it out for us, and then it moves it along. So all we need to do to bring that in is we just import logger from Redux logger. And this is a really handy middleware because once we finish writing all of this configuration and setup, which is quite extensive, I totally understand, it will make it much easier for us to understand what it is that we did. So once we have these required libraries, we then import in our root reducer from our root reducer file. And now we have to actually set up our middlewares. So the middlewares that the store is expecting from Redux is going to be an array. And that array, we can set ourselves as this thing called middlewares, right? We just set it as this const, and we make it an array, and inside is our logger middleware. This is pretty much just that function that I was telling you about from Redux logger, and we're putting it inside of this array. Next, in order for us to actually make our store, we're going to literally call it our store, const store equals create store. And this is a function that gets both a root reducer and also the return value of apply middlewares. And inside of this apply middleware, we are going to spread in our middlewares. So what this will do is this will spread in all of the methods or all of the values in this array into this function call as individual arguments. And this way, if we ever needed to add more things to the middleware, we can just add it to this array value that we have here. Now, you'll actually see us do this later on in the lesson, but for now, just understand that we're doing it in this syntax just because it's more scalable. And you'll totally see that as we build it out. Otherwise, we didn't actually have to set this value. We could have just put them in manually, like so. This would have perfectly worked because we only have the one logger middleware, and apply middleware just takes an infinite number of different middlewares that we can just put them in like so. But instead, we're just going to do it this way because in the future, we might want to modify this array based on certain conditions. You'll totally see it, don't worry, but this is just one thing to keep in mind. And with this, we've written our store. We're going to export this out as the default value. And then with this new store object that we've instantiated with create store, we're going to bring this into our index.js and we're going to pass it into our provider. So I know it's been a while since we covered the provider in the last lesson, but just as a refresher, the provider is this component class that we get from React Redux that once past the store object, we'll be able to give that Redux store context to the rest of the application. So we can dispatch actions to that store, or we can actually pull values off of the store and into our components. And it all comes from this provider. So in order to do that, we need to import in the store from our store.js. which is inside of our Redux folder, as the store. Now, once we have this, we are just going to pass it in as a value called store in provider, like so. And that's it. It's a lot of configuration, guys. I definitely totally understand that it's way more configuration than you guys are probably used to seeing. But with this code written like this, we now have access to Redux inside of our application. We had to build out our store. We had to configure a root reducer, so we had some kind of value for us to actually display. But now that we have this, we can actually start implementing the right actions into our application so that Redux can start storing the value of our user into our new user reducer and out of our app.js state. Now, in order for us to do that, we actually have to create the action that is going to trigger the correct case inside of our switch statement. Now, as we know, this set current user is what the action type we're expecting to be, so that it sets the current user value inside of our user reducer object as the payload of this action object. Now, what we're going to do in order to make that is we are going to create these action creator functions. And they sound way more complicated than they actually are. So what we're going to do to make them is we're going to put them inside of a file called user.actions.js. And they literally are just functions that return objects. The only thing is that each object is in the correct format that the action is expected to be. So for our set current user action creator function, it's going to be a function that takes one parameter, the user object, whatever that user object is. It's either our user auth, right, or our user snapshot object that we create inside of our Firebase utils, as you remember from our app.js, or it's null. So instead of calling this.setState, we are going to fire off an action that holds that value that we were setting state to before, and we're just going to call it our user. Then what this function returns is an object where the type is set current user. This is the exact same string that our reducer is expecting. So we just got to remember that. We got to make sure that we always align the action creator's type with the reducer's type expectation in order to create the appropriate effects in our reducer. And what we're going to do with that user is we're going to set it as the payload. So as I mentioned, this shape of an object is all a action is. It has a type, which is equal to a string, and then it has a payload. And because these strings should never change, we want to use capital and snake case. So we want to use underscores wherever there's spaces. And with this, we've created our user action. So we have the action that our components are going to leverage in order to actually update our reducers with the appropriate values. Now, I know this was a lot of configuration in these last 2 lessons. It was just us setting up so many things. And honestly, it's a lot and it's very overwhelming. Redux is definitely one of the more challenging concepts in the React ecosystem because of this reason. There's so much setup required just to get started with Redux. And in each of this setup, there's a concept we got to think about because Redux is so opinionated about how to be used. And this is the trade-off of using Redux. But I promise you, it's extremely, extremely valuable and super powerful. So in the following lessons, we're going to see how we use this, how we bring this into components, how this all looks in the end. And I know you had to endure a lot of this configuration, but hopefully, at least conceptually, it made sense about why we had to do this. But we're going to use this a lot. We're going to repeat this pattern many, many times. And once you watch those lessons, please come back to these videos, watch this again, try and do it yourself. Try and set up this Redux yourself using the Redux documentation that I'm going to link inside of your resources. And you'll hopefully understand why it's all happening. But Redux is definitely a very large picture kind of library. You have to see it all in action before all of these pieces slowly start to make sense. And once it all clicks, you're gonna have that eureka moment. So with all of these concepts and all of this configuration that Andre and I have taught you guys, hopefully this makes some sense. If it doesn't, I promise you by the end, it will definitely make sense because we're going to use it a lot. So now that we've finished our setup, we're going to bring this into our components so we can start leveraging not only the new user action we created, but also this current user value inside of our reducer. And we're going to do that in the next lesson.